You need to make yourself educated in order not to be exploited. That's why you care about grading.
People still look at the books and the holders and they say, do I feel like this is an 8.0? Does this look like an 8.0 to me? Or is this my kind of 8.0? They may completely disagree with the grade and say, CGC missed the boat on this one.
This is a show about bridging generations of grading. We have Gary Carter, who co-wrote the first book. And then, of course, we have Matt Nelson, who's written the latest and greatest book on comic book grading. Gary, from your perspective, what is grading in comic books?
So grading to me, it is an attempt to provide descriptors which communicate the level of preservation of a specimen of a printed object that's made almost always out of paper. And so basically there are forces in the world which, because of the very nature of this mechanical device, it opens and closes and moves, and the fact that it is most often cheaply produced, meaning that they're using the absolute minimum cost to make it, this mechanical device, that the chances of it degrading over time are great, and the chances of it being preserved over time are low. So what happens is that with each passing year, the condition or level of preservation for the vast majority of specimens deteriorates over time for a number of reasons, which of course we can get into the granular level of that. Grading is an attempt to communicate a level of preservation for these paper items.
For me, I guess it would be when an item becomes collectible, when there's some intrinsic value that's assigned to it, because as you said, it's usually made on the cheap, and they're usually meant to be disposed of, ephemeral material. But at some point, whether it's sports cards or comic books, movie posters, there's some value attached to it. And at that point, once there's a value, an intrinsic value, and then coupled with a monetary value, then people start to compare existing copies. Because obviously in these cases, there's multiple copies that survive. And because the grade determines the value, then people are interested in, okay, this one looks nicer than that one. So what do you call these things? And so you have to come up with terminology for that. And then you have definitions on exactly how what each of those grades represent. And then of course, as things become more sophisticated, then the grading becomes more sophisticated. You have a larger scale. Obviously comic books are the most complicated to me compared to, say, a sports card or playing card because
Or a stamp.
or a stamp. Yeah, because there's more surface area. There's multiple pages. You got staples going on.
But in simplest terms, if you're talking to a person new in the hobby, a new collector, why does grading matter and why does precision matter in grading?
Well, actually, it's the answer to every hobby question and the answer to every printing question. And the answer is MONEY. Explains everything. If you don't know how to grade and you accept on its face someone else's assessment of grade and therefore their assignment of value, then you may win that game. You may have a fair and even trade, which is extremely rare, or you may lose that game. 2 years later, when you go to sell the item and you go to someone else and you say, I bought this book for X amount of dollars and they said it was fine or fine plus, and the person who you're trying to sell it to says, well, you're out of your mind. That's VG if I ever saw it. Now you're faced with being impacted monetarily. And so that's why having the ability to depend on a grade matters, not because of your immediate transaction, although it might affect money at that point, but it's going to be the fact that everybody forgets that we're only temporary custodians of these things. Mortality makes that happen. And so eventually, at some point, no matter who you are, that book is going to go back into the marketplace for somebody, some way, and then the evolution of grading. It's something that I have tried to share with so many novice collectors. You need to make yourself educated in order not to be exploited. That's why you care about grading. And also on the positive side of things, the pure joy of seeing a specimen of a book you loved as a kid in the condition with which you remember it being on the newsstand, a very high, beautiful, unblemished copy, that contributes a sense of nostalgia and joy. My best definition of nostalgia for me personally, I don't remember where I heard it, but someone said that it was a wistful yearning for the past.
I was reflecting while you were talking, and I'm thinking that I never read comic books and stepped away and came back. I was, I guess, a collector and a reader all at once in the beginning. And so for me, when I was going back into the older books, it was all new. It was exploration for me. As far as the grading goes, there's before CGC and after CGC. So before CGC is certainly, like Gary touched on, educating yourself, because when you were buying and selling, you were having to take the seller's grade at face value, and and you wanted to make sure that you were getting something that was fairly represented within the ballpark. And dealers or sellers' reputations were kind of built around their grading.
Well stated. Well
Yeah.
stated.
A lot of collectors gravitated towards certain dealers that had great reputations, who were right on the money. Maybe they were maybe even a little tight, and if they were a little loose or somebody didn't like the grade or the book for whatever reason, they'd take it back, and so that was really, the foundational aspect of being a dealer. And then with CGC, since the grading aspect is taken out of that equation, now what people are looking for in terms of grades are, it's still there somewhat, because people still look at the books and the holders and they say, do I feel like this is an 8.0? Does this look like an 8.0 to me? Or is this my kind of 8.0? They may completely disagree with the grade and say CGC missed the boat on this one, or it may have an attribute that they don't like, or a defect. But generally speaking, if they accept the grade, then it becomes, the granular level of grading. Now, can they get a higher grade? It gets back to what Gary's saying, MONEY, and so the focus on grading becomes, in addition to liking the book that you're buying, is if there's any potential, improvement to the book. Obviously, there's still tons of raw books, raw sales that are going on, tons of that. In fact, probably the majority of sales these days are still raw books. There's just millions of books that are changing hands. And so for that aspect, the same rule back then applies today, which is learn how to grade, protect yourself when you buy, especially now because you got so many sellers, but also educate yourself, because when you buy CDC graded books, you want to make sure that you like the book that's in the holder. And then beyond that, is there any benefit to potentially getting an upgrade, or if it's restored, can you unrestore it? Maybe in a rare case, there was a pedigree that was missed. So educating yourself on pedigree is important for that, because that adds value as well. So I think that that's what's important for me to collectors, and it really hasn't changed over the years. It has gotten easier. There's more information out there, and you've got CGC out there protecting, or that it's leveled the playing field, but it's still just as critical to learn grading.
So when people are trying to grade and learning the process, what are challenges that many collectors often face?
When CGC opened 25 years ago, everyone collecting comics had some foundation of grading knowledge, something. Maybe it might have been a little, might have been a lot, but there was something there, because like Gary was saying, that was what you had to arm yourself with to go out there and collect and buy. If you're spending real money on a book, whether it's $50, 500, or 5,000, you had to have some knowledge there. But over time, CGC is, for lack of a better word, it's allowed them to get lazy. They don't have to learn how to grade, and that's fine. There's tons of people that to this day, couldn't grade their way out of a paperback, but they just depend on CGC grading, and that's fine. The challenge now is, if you want to close that gap, you have to understand how CGC grades. Before it was about trying to find the dealers that graded the way you liked. And now it's trying to understand how CGC grades. And this is also critical if you're submitting books to CGC, because you want to make sure that you're submitting books that are worth getting graded, And so you have to analyze, you have to, grade your books beforehand, check them before you send them in. There's so much more information online now, and you got the grading guide. But it's also become a lot more nuanced too. And so there's a lot more to learn than there used to be.
Let's start with the fact that let's suppose you go to the average convention, right? And you walk up to a dealer with boxes and backboards, right? What percentage are CGC or other forms of slab grading, and what percentage are raw books? And I would argue that still the massive majority of books are certainly not in plastic containers. They're just bagged and boarded, sticker puts on them with the price and sometimes the grade, right? So we're all faced with this challenge. Who decides what something is worth? If you're a pure capitalist, you don't care about guides, you don't care about advice. You say that an item is worth what it sells for, period. And that each transaction is individual and separate from another transaction, according to laissez-faire capitalism, right? What I love Strange Adventures 114 because I bought it off the stands and would pay twice what it was worth if I could find a perfectly mint copy. But the next guy down the line goes, "Hey, I don't like that Silver Age sci-fi stuff. In fact, it's kind of stupid. I want Spider-Man 3, you know?" So it all depends on the person and the situation and the variability of the individual capitalistic transaction. So that's one side of the equation. But the other side of the equation is that being able to grade is the first step in establishing value, regardless of who you turn to as an advisor on that value, whether it's the Overstreet Price Guide, whether it's going online and looking what other copies have sold for. If you can't get some zeroing in of the grade, how are you going to have any sort of intelligence when it comes to establishing value? And by the way, if you take that step from establishing the grade to establishing the value, and then the final piece of that little flow chart is MONEY, once again. I have seen so many young collectors have the joy taken right out of them when some unscrupulous dealer, and there's not very many of them, but they do exist, uh, sells him a copy of something that he doesn't even take out of the bag for 10 years. He just wanted that because it meant something to him. It was an emotional purchase. So it says because the guy who sold it to him wrote near mint on the label, may or may not be true. And so that person 10 years later takes that book out for the first time and looks at it and takes it back to a dealer at a convention, and boom, it turns out that it's way, way less than near mint. Or the centerfold is missing, or the backing board covered up the tear on the back cover, or all kinds of things. So I would say to young collectors, you have a 90% chance of being happy with your purchase. I would say that 9 out of 10 dealers are straight shooters. They're honest. They're not trying to exploit people because they don't view you as a single transaction. They want you to come back and buy more books. So they're motivated by the highest level of capitalism, which is honesty and integrity. Being honest and integritous in sales and in valuation and grading gets you to come back for 50 transactions over your lifetime, not one. And then there's the other kind of dealer that gives us all a bad name.
In this business, it's interesting to watch how unscrupulous people can still continue to make money because of the desire, the burning desire that collectors have, that they want something so bad. It doesn't matter who has it. If you have it, they're going to buy it from you. So
That's one of the probably the unsung Ten Commandments of the dark side of collecting.
Yes, yes, yeah.
As grading becomes more precise and there's more variability and there's more detail, there's more things to identify. You could see how more and more people would be willing to pay for a service that would help them through that. It's one thing if a book is less than $100. Come on, you know, uh, which is what, maybe 90% of all specimens out there. who cares? I say it's fine, you say it's very fine. You still want $50 for the book, and I
Right.
still want to pay you 40.
I guess back before CGC, you didn't really have the nuanced grading. I mean, you had the grades, obviously, and the half grades and the quarter grades, but the granular level on each of those grades and what went into that and how each defect was classified based on its severity and so on. It really wasn't necessary because people were just like, all right, it's ballpark. You called it VF, I called it VF minus, whatever. We're fine. We're good. And then what I
And the book was $2.
yeah, and the price was cheap enough that most of the time it didn't matter. And then now I fast forward, and part of the reason why I wrote the book was because, values went up. We're grading all these books. Everybody gets into collecting. A lot of people are now getting in that don't know how to grade, and they're going, why? Why? What is, how are you arriving at this grade? How did you get to this? Or my book has this defect, and I think it's X, but you're calling it Y because of this defect. Or, what effect does this defect have? So it kind of, the grading on that granular level really caused a lot of questions to come up as to how we were arriving at these grades given all these defects. And so I think that was really one thing, was to just kind of, unveil, the standards behind CGC grading and say, look, that we're not just playing guessing games over here. We're not just throwing darts at a board. There's actually scales and charts and graphs and definitions that go on here based on everything we've seen for all these years.
Standardizing something from from an artistic endeavor, from an instinctual endeavor, to standardized evaluative criteria is one of the most difficult steps that any evaluation system, whether it's engineering standards for bolts and nuts, all the way over to the level of preservation of paper and everything in between, that it's a very difficult step to standardize evaluative criteria. And the reason is that there's 8 million opinions, and all of them think they're right.
Yeah.
That's why I started that first grading guide with the phrase, grading is an art, not a science, because a science implies criteria, but I think it's evolving now. I would argue that we're not quite to the scientific level, because you're not looking at books under an electron microscope. But there's going to be a time, Matt. There is going to be a time in the future, we're not going to be around, where there's going to be a machine where you simply run, like almost like a scanner, where you run the comic book through. It's been programmed because it has graded 80 million comic books, and it's going to give you a ballpark in terms of where that specimen is in the spectrum. We've graded 485 of them, and this is number 6. And we believe that the verbal term fine plus is applicable.
It's interesting because you talk about standardization in industries. In comic books, it's like every comic starts off day one at the printers, every copy. Let's just say they all start the same, and then they're distributed, and then they all start to fall in grade, so to speak, because of all the different handling defects and environmental defects that come into play over years. So what you end up having, fast forward decades, is, like Action 1. You've got Action 1, you've got, say, 100 existing copies left out of hundreds of thousands printed. And if you compared all 100 of them side by side, they would all be like snowflakes. None of them would be exactly the same. In fact, they would all be probably quite different. And even if you looked at every A of 15, thousands that exist, they're like snowflakes. There's no two that are exactly alike. And so you're really, the variation or the differentiation from the degradation of the books over the years that's what makes grading to me so subjective and more of an art form, is because you really are grading. Every book is really an individual grade in and of itself, and you have to squeeze it into this grading scale of 25 points. And so, but not every book is exactly the same. So you end up having a bunch of, all the 6.0s ever graded in an A of 15. They're all going to be a little bit different, and so I think that's the challenge. It'll never be scientific because there's always going to be a bit of an art form to grading because of that factor.
Well stated. That was that was absolutely accurate. I could not concur more. And I would say that if we really want to blow the minds of new collectors, we further complicate what you just said with the fact that there's different paper in different eras for different publishers at different binderies, different countries of source, different trees. Have you ever heard the term SPF? It's a general term lumber yards use for, we're not telling you what you're going to get, but it's either going to be spruce, pine, or fir. It's called SPF, but we don't tell you which species, right? Well, if imagine the variability going back in time to 1933 in the paper industry, in the number of binderies in the United States. There's an old saying that before you explore the unexplored continent, you have to make a map of what's known, right? And so in the first grading guide, that glossary was an attempt to make a map of what is known before we jumped off to explore the unexplored part.
So, Matt, earlier you brought up this idea of like an 8.0, and you said some people might look at that 8.0 and they would say, this is my type of like 8.0. And other folks may say, that's not my type of 8.0. And I want you to speak a little bit more to that, because I think that that's important for collectors, because that may determine whether they get a book that they like or it's a book that just doesn't resonate with them.
Talking about a CGC graded book, an 8.0 or a 9.4, I guess there's the things you can see through the holder, and there's the things that you can't see. The things you can't see would be like page quality. So that's an easy one because a lot of people have preferences about page quality. Obviously, some people only want white pages or a certain threshold on the vintage books, like say Golden Age, where it's not realistic to be able to just buy all white page Golden Age. And some people don't really care too much. They just want the book. But as far as like visual appeal goes, I think I've noticed some of the people's Piccadillys. It depends on, I guess, well, it's probably more centered around high grade books because obviously the lower the grade is, the more defects there are, and the less picky that you can be. But on high grade books, I would say like one big thing would be the ink strike, or at least the colors, how much color vibrancy is left in the book. During the printing process, at different parts during the process, they fill the ink up again. So there's, it runs a little low and the colors are a little muted. And then all of a sudden in the middle of, the printing run, it gets dark again. So people are looking at copies that have, say for instance, red, and they have some that are deep red, kind of red, orangish red, then you get into like faded covers that are like orange or even, like light orange. People want the darkest colors possible. That seems to be a big thing, particularly with the vintage collectors. Another one would be like centering, miswrap books. This is going to be more of a factor on like your Bronze Age books, maybe your Silver Age books, and sometimes with your gold. But the Bronze Age books in particular, because I think that's where we saw it seemed like a large percentage of the print runs were miswrapped, where you get that white strip down the spine or the cover's slightly skewed.
I also found that the case with the 52 pagers, by the way.
Oh yeah.
They're
And so
notorious for being miscut.
yeah. And so that's and miscut's another one, where people don't want the oblong shaped books from the Golden Age, so people want it centered, and that's obviously reflected in card collecting because centering is like one of the major factors in grading. Now it's not as much in comic books in grading, but in terms of eye appeal and people's preferences, I think centering is a big factor. And then defects, just general defects. People maybe they don't like a crease. They'd rather have an 8.0 book with defects that they can't really see, instead of some 2-inch crease or whatever in the front cover. That can be applied to all grades and all collectors and all books. Is that if it looks better than the grade, it's going to have better eye appeal. It's going to probably have a little bit more demand behind that book. And dealers in some cases will actually price those books higher. There's one particular dealer I know that we've had a lot of discussions about how he purposely seeks out, 1/8s, 1/5s, 2/0s, for instance, a book that has a clean spine split, but otherwise looks like a VF. And he can get 4.0 money for those books just based on the IPO alone. People are paying beyond the grade because it looks so nice. So I think those are a few, but there's so many other factors involved there, but I think those are the big ones that come to mind.
Thank you so much, Matt and Gary. And you may recall that Gary talked about How do you determine the price of a comic book? Well, you can check out this video to hear my take. In my opinion, it is the most thorough video on YouTube. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you around real soon.